when I first agreed to do this, Paul had asked me, well, why do you write about water? And I have a little story about that. It goes back to my childhood and growing up on Fountain Creek with Carol Baker. And we were actually coming back from Johnny Valentine's house. We were playing with Play-Doh at the house. Ferris had made us some cookies, and we went down to the Bill Alt swinging plank across the Fountain Creek. And what we were doing there is we went down a bike path too. It washed out in the '65 flood, so it's no longer there. But we went down, and Carol was doing a science project. She was sticking thumbtacks in the heads of Arkansas darters. And so I had agreed to help her. And we went out on that plank, Bill Alt's plank, and we're out in the middle of Fountain Creek, and I got my ball cap off, and I'm helping fish out the little darters so she can stick the thumbtacks. They were different colored thumbtacks. She wanted to see where the fish were going. And this was her science project. Is Dominic still here? Yeah, this was Carol's science project. So anyway, I'm doing that, and all of a sudden I feel something come up behind me. At first I thought it was another flood. So I'm kind of trying to keep my balance, and all of a sudden I'm face first in the creek. And so then I said, I get up and I kind of brush the selenium off, and then I got rid of some of the E. coli. There were some phreatophytes in my pocket, and so I got all that off. And then I asked Carol, why'd you do that? She pushed me in, you know, why did you push me in the creek? And she said, yes, we go. And I said, Carol, take the worms out of your mouth. And then she said, well, I thought you wanted to get into water, so I'd help you out. So anyway, that's my opening story. That's payback. She was a little mean to her panel yesterday, I thought. What I really came to talk about was this publication here. It grew out of a kind of an idea that we had at the newspaper. I write, for those of you that don't know, I write a lot about water. Somewhere between 500 and 1,000 articles a year, depending on how ambitious I'm feeling. And go to a lot of water meetings and statewide water meetings and local water meetings. I talk to a lot of farmers. I talk to a lot of city people. I'm always talking to somebody about water. In this case, I got an email one day from Jane Rawlings, who's our assistant publisher, and she said, you should consider entering the Pulitzer Prize contest. And I'm thinking of the other things that have gone on in the last year. We've had some major earthquakes. There's been an oil spill in the Gulf. There was WikiLeaks. There's total unrest in the Middle East. And the economy seems to keep spiraling downward. Immigration has become an issue, and then there's the president's birth certificate. And so with all these other big issues here, I'm saying, okay, well, Arkansas Valley water issues, yeah, that ought to grab the Pulitzer. Yeah, we could do that. So then I started thinking about it, and I was looking through this collection. We save all the articles that I write every year, the hard copies of them, so I'm looking through all the papers, and I stopped on this one particularly good story that I'd written about statewide water supply issues, and noticed it was under the photograph from the Chilean Frijoles festival that we have in Pueblo each year, and I thought, well, what's a Pulitzer judge going to think when he sees this story under this photograph of that. So I said, we got to display these better. So the first thing I did, and you'll notice up here, it says photos by Brian Kelson, and he's a very good photographer. He's won several awards at the Chieftain. I took Brian into the conference room and I said, I'm thinking of doing these stories about people and water on the Arkansas River, and wanted to see if we could do something special with the photographs. And he looks at me and he says, as my colleagues often do, dude, do you think anyone's ever told you that writing about water is a form of sickness? And then he agreed to do it. Yeah. If you got to know Brian, I mean, that's just how he is. He'll give you the sarcastic answer first, and for gentle souls like me that don't have a sarcastic bone in their body, it's really hurtful. So we came up with an idea, and then the next thing was, well, what to write about. I mean, I write about a lot of different things, and so then it became one of those things where you go, what not to write about. So I started crossing things off, and then I thought, well, it'd be much more interesting if these turned into stories of who I'm going to write about. So instead of choosing topics, I chose people, and that's what it led into. I made some rules for myself in writing it. In none of the stories would I mention acre feet or cubic feet per second. They would be very non-technical. They would be just about the people I was writing about and why they are involved with the river. It's nobody commenting about what these people do, which was another way I could have taken it, or anything like that. It was their own stories. Then we determined that we would make the graphics as complicated as possible for people who wanted information. So we made some very, very complicated graphics for this that we had a lot of cooperation from different agencies on making them. Let's see, Paul, where's the, oh, this is the thing. And I'll screw this up. The one on the right? That's right. Advances it. Okay. The other thing is why I write about water. I need to go back a little bit. We had, back in 2004, had 3 different people who had been the water reporter, and my publisher, Bob Rawlings, is just a little concerned about water. And I had actually written quite a bit about water in the 80s and 90s. I covered a lot of the AWDI stories out of the San Luis Valley, and a lot of the water transfers with Aurora, Colorado Springs in this valley back in the 90s. And I always liked it because I could be out of the office for several days a week and say I was writing about water. So, and I like the mileage checks, and I like staying in different places, and I don't have to sit at a desk. So that's basically why I write about water. Okay, we're going to move into here. Oh, and if you want to know how the Pulitzer thing turned out, we tied for 4th. We just kind of deduced that because I tied for 4th in 2 categories. I entered 2 categories and they only announced the top 3, and I wasn't. So that's the story of the Pulitzers there. But we still have other contests and other hopes that we'll win something with this. A funny story about the Pulitzers. Well, it was kind of aggravating at the time. They wanted us to put everything in a scrapbook, and that means, you know, tear the pages out and just put them like in a photo album or something like that. And we had this nice publication already written up that was like a scrapbook. So I sent that in the first time, and the Pulitzer committee has a bulldog of a secretary who calls me up and says, this doesn't conform to the rules. You have submitted an ineligible entry, but we'll give you a chance to make it right. And you know, it was already past the deadline. I said, oh, okay, well, what do I have to do? He says, well, first of all, there can only be 10 stories. So I had to throw out, I had 14 profiles of people in there and one overall story. So I had to throw out 4 of the stories, and I'm not going to tell which ones I threw out because it might hurt somebody's feelings. So after that, then I tore up a couple copies of this section here, because you can duplicate them, but they have to be in the same type size as they were printed in the first paper. So so anyway, after doing that, then I sent it in, and I still didn't win. So the stories are in a different order in the publication than they were in the newspaper. And part of it was because that's how they fit. And the other part was in the publication that is distributed here, I really wanted to give the recreation and wildlife parts of it the last word. In the series that ran in the paper, I gave the last word to storage, and the super ditch were the 2 last stories in it. So, which were the kind of the solutions that we've come up with so far in the valley. So I put them in a different order, kind of on purpose there. The order that they ran in the paper, the first place is that you wanted, it just comes down to Sunday, and the ones that don't have very much jumps, extra graphics or anything in on a Monday, just for the space needs of the paper. The magic number of 14 that we chose was the number that would fit in the 2 weeks at the end of the year when everybody likes to take time off, so they don't mind having a project that eats up tons of space in the newspaper. So that's how that part of it came. Now we'll go into who we actually featured. It said, you'll notice it's kind of unusual up there. It says Persuasion by Chris Woodka, and I'll get into that. This worked out so that every one of these photos involved about 3 or 4 phone calls that I had to talk people into doing this. So here we go. This is Don Colancia, and we had a lot of fun with this. This is a new order of things too. This is the order that we shot them in. So they're in a different order than they were in the newspaper in this, and now they're in a different order for this show. We went over to the treatment facilities at the Board of Waterworks to do this one, and I didn't know there seemed to be about 50 people working there, because they were all running around and finding these beakers, and we probably violated several EPA standards by mixing some of this stuff in there, but we wanted the right colors. I had done an earlier story on Don talking about some of the same things we were talking about this morning, endocrine disruptors, and I didn't understand any of it, but I did. But I tried to write it up then, and I thought this was like a second take at that story, because I thought it was a very interesting story about water quality, how we can measure smaller and smaller things, and then how we have to, once we can measure those smaller things, then we got to get them out of the water. So that was the gist of this story. Don was a very good guide for that, and the photos, the reason that I emphasize them in this is because I think that of all the people, when I talked to them about this series, they thought that they would not have read the stories without the intriguing photos that drew them into it. And that was part of the method of my madness to, when we started it, was, all right, entertaining stories, and they'll have attractive photos by a very good photographer. So that it worked out pretty well. This is another guy from the Pueblo Board of Waterworks. This one we thought would take a lot of persuasion, but he really wanted to do this. And what's even funnier is that everybody who works for him wanted him to do this. And this was the only photo shoot that I had a conflict that day. I wasn't able to attend, but I heard that they kept wanting him to do it over and over and over. So he was a good sport about it. I think he's wearing his second string there, but you know, we even made him put on a tie, and this was about the last day that you could really run sprinklers, because I think they maybe even had to turn them on again to get him to do it. So, and it was actually a very nice day. We just didn't care about the temperature. We wanted the light right. So. This is Sieta Moss. Sieta was very cooperative in doing this, and I think very informative. She gave me a list of about 500 species of birds that they counted in the area, and wanted me to publish them all. But I didn't. So we went with some more general graphics about wildlife there, and there's a lot of different ways we could have gone with wildlife, but Sieta has been very persuasive herself in the Arkansas Basin Roundtable and getting people to recognize the non-consumptive needs of the Arkansas River, and has made some very good points about the value of bird watching and to the economy. Bird watching and wildlife watching actually generates more revenue than hunting and fishing. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. In southeastern Colorado, this is an area where we have a very relative strength to the rest of the state. I've been spending a lot of time out at Los Animas lately, and there are just, you know, hundreds of different birds out there. One of the people I was with kept stopping the truck, and it took about 3 hours to drive around his farm because he kept showing me the birds. So, the state Division of Wildlife has a birding guide for southeastern Colorado. It was the first one developed for the state, so it's a very good issue that we can work on in this part of the state. This is a diagram showing how we set up some of the photos. And you know, they were actually, at this point, I put that in there to talk about how Brian's help in putting this together. Brian doesn't know a thing about water, and so when we were driving to each of the assignments where we would take these photos, he would be asking me questions, and he'd say, "This is a stupid question. What does this mean? What is it?" And it kind of helped me as thinking of how I was going to write these, so that I could put them on an understandable level, because he doesn't read my stories. He doesn't know what these issues are about. So here's the thing, and I often find that with whichever of our photographers I'm with, that it's like, you know, taking someone who's very curious but doesn't know a lot about what you're writing about. So if you ever need to crystallize your thoughts, take about a 2 or 3 hour ride with a photographer, and you'll get a good idea of what you're talking about. Now the graphics. This is a treatment plant operation. It's only actually half of the treatment plant, but I couldn't put the whole thing in there. And one of the on one of the proofs, we print out proofs of the pages before they're actually printed in the newspaper, and my managing editor, Steve Henson, you know, on the proof writes WTF, and on top of this, I say, he says, why, this means nothing to me, let's get rid of it. I said, well, it means something to somebody, you know, and we went to the trouble to create it. And, our chief graphics artist, designer, Sherry Zanatelli, you know, spent about a day creating this graphic. So even though we had the general idea from the water plant, we had to go in and, you know, get it so it could be printed in the newspaper. And so I think the graphics are very interesting to me as I look at it. I think people will, my idea was that you would read the story, look at the photo, read the story, and then get into learning a little bit more about it by reading the graphics. So I put as much information as I could into that. Then I also, at the end of the project, because I had to leave so much information out, I put in a series of key points that added additional information for people who wanted to know more. This guy lost his job. It's worked out better for some people than others. He got another job though. Fountain Creek was a very big part of it. For the last few years, I've invested quite a bit of my time into covering the development of the Fountain Creek district, and still do. I think it's one of the most important things we've done, and we talked. There was a little bit about the Round Mountain project that Jairus was talking about it as actually getting something done. I think this actually got something done, and I was very skeptical that it would get anything done when it first started. So I thought it was a very important part of the series. And I had gotten wind that Gary was actually leaving the job before the series came out, and I thought, oh, great, you know. So I got the poster child for Fountain Creek, who isn't even going to be on it anymore. And I was, you know, I was pleased by the way that he exited that board and the way things have turned out. We actually wanted to get him in the creek at first, but we just decided, well, let's just have him in a hole in the creek, and then after you dig about a foot in that particular sandbank, you start to hit water, and so it became a kind of a test of wills between how wet Gary was willing to get his boots and how low we could make him go. So, and that is my shovel. And this was a preview of the drought, I think. It was very windy that day we were out there on Johns Field. It was after I think after a lower arc meeting when we went out there, and we were already kind of foggy brained from the lower arc meeting, but and we were just looking, a lot of these we didn't know where we would wind up shooting it or how we would wind up shooting it, and it was important, I think, to get something about the super ditch into this there, because it is a developing thing that's going to be very important to the valley. Mike continues to advocate for improved value of crops, and recently Bob and Jane came back to me and asked, well, how can we get farmers to grow more valuable stuff? And I said, I really don't know. So I've been asking farmers about it, and I've come to the conclusion that I really don't know. Didn't they used to grow those things? I said, yeah, they used to grow more of those things. I did a history series a couple years ago that showed that you know, there was much more diversity in the crops in the valley in past years, but because one thing and another, mostly because the processing plants are no longer there, we now don't grow many of these things, but we could in the future. And it's actually it's actually was really interesting to me. One of Mike's points always is that if we don't have as much water, we can grow crops with less consumptive use that are worth more. There are, of course, labor issues. There's more intensive work in getting the crop out of the field, and that's sort of some of the answers the farmers have given me. There's a lot of risk in putting in a vegetable crop that could be hailed out late in the season, and I think those are all good reasons. And I think that probably as things go on and people get more sophisticated about their farming and maybe some more opportunities, in Pueblo we have farmers markets that keep a vegetable industry alive. So I think that locavore movement that we were talking about yesterday, that kind of plays into this too. So, and I see it as maybe the farmers that stay in farming could invest a small portion of their land into this type of crop, and much like the super ditch, have the opportunity to make more money doing different things. Didn't work out so good for this guy either. He lost his job. I think the governor saw him fishing and said, "Well," you know, so. But anyway, Reed has worked for years on the recreation interests on the Arkansas River, and I think the recognition was well deserved. He was a board member at the Colorado Water Conservation Board and still is on the Southeast District, and I think he at meetings where I've seen Reed in action, he tends to ask well, not photographer grade questions, but questions about water that improve all of our understanding of it by going back into some basic things. It's not that he doesn't understand things, but he wants to understand them better and is truly concerned about it. And I think the longer that you work in it, and I found this myself, is the more questions that come up to you, and he has an active mind and is engaged, and very productive member of the round table as well. That's Brian. We threw that picture in of him because we wanted to put ourselves a little bit into the story too, because all these things were a joint effort. Brian often told the people that when we were taking their picture, you know, he was connected to the river by water sports and that sort of thing. He was a big cheerleader for the kayak course coming through Pueblo, and a good source of information in the early years of the flow program when it wasn't working so well as to when it wasn't working so well, so I know that I needed to start calling and bothering people, so that's what Brian does. This is just the halfway point of my presentation, and I wanted to have 20 slides, so I threw this one in. Actually, I saw these on Letterman one night. They're really pretty entertaining. The squirrels actually go water skiing. So. I guess that could be a wildlife thing too. Melissa, I actually remembered from last year's Arkansas Arbois, as Terry Hart called it, the Arbois Forum last year. And I tracked her down, and we managed to get up there before there got to be too much snow on the ground. I had to do a kind of a reconnaissance run up there, and this was my most personally involved mission, because on my run up there to cover one of the meetings in Leadville of their watershed group, I hit a deer on the highway. So, and it was you know, kind of, it wasn't a big deer, but you know, it was traumatic. And I went up there and the rest of the day, and they were talking about things that were way too technical for me at that meeting, and I kind of got my way through that story, and then went into, I asked Melissa then, well, could we come up and do a story on just your involvement with it. And it turned out a lot differently than I thought, this particular story, because I thought she was going to talk a lot about the watershed group and all that, and mainly her main point of it was education. She thought that it was important that the things that they do on this watershed study be shared with students, and so it's kind of like you go out looking for one story and come back with another one, and I think it was a better story. There's Bud, and this we did. Now keep in mind these are in order, so we were just at 11,000 feet and trekking down and kind of wiped out. So we had lunch with Bud up in Leadville, and then we went on another long drive to the Twin Lakes Tunnel, and he said, well, he said they were going to turn off the water, and so when we got there, this is what we found instead, and that worked out better too, because he had a couple pairs of waders, and he and Brian went over toward the tunnel then and got this picture. And it's one of my favorites of the whole series that we did, just because of how it turned out. And you can see there was some snow on the ground at this point, and we were running out of time. This was probably, when did we do that? November? It was clear into November before we got this done. And this was after we'd been working on this for about a month. So we had to set up all the pictures when we could both get to them. This one I liked a lot too. Dale's kind of shy and didn't want to do this, but he tried to talk. He was one that tried to talk me into doing somebody else. And I said, these are people that I already know for the most part. I wanted people who have been active in water issues to talk about them, not just any cattle farmer or whatever. He's got a lot of cows, and one of the unnerving things was getting into his truck with him. A lot of the times I'd ride in the truck so I could write down notes, and my notes are really kind of entertaining to look at from this because they go all over the page. But he had like a big rifle in there, and I said, what are we going to do here today, Dale? I don't see any water commissioners around. And he said, no, sometimes we got to shoot the sick ones. And I said, the water commissioners? No, the cows. So that was our day with Dale, and he was very cooperative after we finally got him into the cow pen. I call this one Spider-Man. Bill has been the driving force, I think, behind getting the conduit back into a real project rather than just an idea that everybody always talks about. It's another one of the most significant things that this valley's managed to accomplish in the last few years. Keeping it on track, I think, is a big concern of the Southeast District, and should be a concern of all the towns east of Pueblo, for having a reliable water supply in the future. I made it, excuse me, I made it about halfway up this tower, and then vertigo got the better of me, or common sense or something. And Bill went all the way to the top. His family was down on the sidewalk cheering him on. There's a little place up there, I don't think you can see it, but right near the top where the ladder goes out about 3 feet, and you have to kind of reach out there, and he scrambled right up it and didn't have, it's probably, I don't know what the height of that tower is, probably 150 feet, up there. So anyway, he was, It was another one of those things where my job was persuasion. I had to talk people into it, and I didn't have to talk them into this at all. We came up with the idea driving back from Leadville, and said, well, what if we put him on top of the water tower? And Brian said, okay, that sounds good. You know, I didn't know if I could talk him into it or not, but I asked him, and he said, oh yeah, I've always wanted to do that ever since high school. I guess some of his friends had gone up in high school and he hadn't made the trip then, so this was a lifetime ambition for him. And I thought the water tower really showed what the story was about too. This guy was totally uncooperative. He brought a co-worker named Crystal from his office, and she showed us all kinds of fancy river gauges and everything, and he said it would probably be good if you shot her measuring the river. And I said, we don't, again, it's the same argument that Dale had tried to beg off on. And I said, no, we don't want her, we want you, and all this, and so that's why I wrote up there, we thought about throwing his desk in the river instead. But turns out he doesn't even spend much time at his desk. He's usually at water meetings.